Earthrealm, a realm harboring a multitude of distinct and clamorous races. By the year 342 of the Drea calendar, the realm had narrowly avoided a cataclysm born of a critical threat. The true protagonists of this strange occurrence were none other than the Drea race itself. The Drea race, also known by titles such as the Silver Legion, the Wise Civilization, and the Slave Lords, was an advanced civilization that inhabited Earthrealm and was entirely annihilated by the Nagal invasion. As the superpower of its era, with a population of approximately 5 million, the Drea Kingdom ruled over lands spanning a vast portion of the Askadal mainland, leaving behind numerous advanced architectural structures in its wake. The heart and absolute administrative center of the kingdom is the capital, Lernazan. The Drea calendar, DC, is utilized for all historical records and chronological calculations. The death of King Nirzal, DC 342. The story of Drea's decline is a narrative defined by contradictions, originating in DC 342 with the ascension of matriarch Luria, following the death of her father, King Nirzal. For 3 decades, Luria had meticulously analyzed the vulnerabilities and every political maneuver of her father's reign. She drafted a comprehensive state strategy and policy. Upon seizing the crown, she immediately moved to implement every phase of her exhaustive plan. Matriarch Luria's reforms, DC 342 to 347. Following the ritual known as the Blood Debt, through which the Drea bureaucracy pledged its absolute allegiance to Matriarch Luria, the new sovereign of the Drea throne announced a sweeping policy of state reform. Spanning 5 years, these reforms permeated a vast array of sectors, including but not limited to the military, economy, administration, foreign affairs, trade, and justice. Their ultimate objectives were to fortify Drea's central authority, sustain its claim as a superpower, and aggressively pivot the state toward an absolute imperialist vision. These strategic shifts were designed to undermine the Seram Empire, categorized by the Drea as the ultimate threat, located in the southeast of the Askadal mainland. Furthermore, the reforms initiated a critical reshaping of Drea's perspective on its rigid tradition of slavery, altering how the state would utilize its massive labor force in the conflicts to come. Diplomacy with the envoys of Seram, DC 342 to 344. Through the persistent efforts of the Seram Empire, a period of periodic diplomacy was initiated, and envoys were dispatched to the heart of Drea. While the Seram ruler, Shah Ravan, attempted to gauge the diplomatic reflexes of the new matriarch, his primary focus remained on deciphering the structure and potential consequences of Luria's implemented reforms. The Shah of Seram soon realized that the Drea were not disposing of their surplus slave populations. Instead, they were being driven toward the borders to orchestrate a calculated refugee crisis north of the Seram city of Narvan. Recognizing that these slaves were no longer mere laborers, but an asymmetric military threat, Shah Ravan took immediate defensive measures. He dispatched his right hand and senior field agent Sarkum to the north of Narvan with orders to construct a military buffer zone. Under Sarkum's command, high walls and heavy garrisons were established across the region. The border was transformed into a massive gateway held by elite Seram soldiers and governed by multi-stage security protocols. Independence of the human race. DC 343. Located in the volcanic region named Dwol in northwestern Askadal, the Rawaka Hive Army stood as another of Drea's formidable adversaries. The Rawaka race possessed an organized society. They were insectoid in form and utilized telepathic communication. sustaining their existence through a rigid caste system dictated by hive leader Zarwan. The Rawaka had enslaved the human race, one of Earthrealm's minor races. Human enslavement began in DC 251 and concluded in DC 343. Following numerous failed bids for independence in the past, humanity came to a stark realization. The concept of a singular resistance leader was utterly futile against their slave masters, the Rawaka. When a leader died, the resistance died with them. Therefore, rather than waiting for a savior, they chose to forge and expand an unbreakable, decentralized communication network among the enslaved. Through these collective efforts, a massive exodus of humans managed to breach the Rawaka borders. However, the dead far outnumbered the fugitives. While a fraction of the survivors sought refuge in the northwestern Drea border city of Drevazan, the remainder desperately tried to survive in the frozen, snow-buried expanse of the northernmost Halingant Valley. Beyond its lethal and barren nature, this valley stood as a neutral zone, a bannerless wasteland. The human factions that had actively rejected the dubious sanctuary of the Drea kingdom resolved to forge their own absolute destiny. Refusing to trade one form of subjugation for another, these resilient splinter groups made a desperate yet definitive declaration of sovereignty. They drove their own newly forged banners deep into the lethal permafrost of the Halingant Valley, claiming the once bannerless wasteland as their independent domain. Matriarch Luria, the absolute authority of Drea, saw immediate utility in the human masses taking shelter in Drevazan. Under her directive, these refugees were funneled to the southeastern borders and systematically expelled. This tactic was deliberately executed as a demographic weapon to destabilize the Seram Empire, which held extensive territories in the southeast. Meanwhile, Drea's own subjugated races, the Tessar and the Golem, drew a dangerous inspiration from this human-led emancipation. Forged in the crucible of slavery, Tessar and Golem individuals began laying the clandestine groundwork to shatter Drea's brutal hegemony. The Internal Slave Crisis, DC 343. In the very year the human race secured its independence, imperceptible fractures began to form within Drea's own system of subjugation. Matriarch Luria's reformist agenda did not inherently dictate the perpetual retention of slaves. However, the meticulous calculations of the Drea bureaucracy contained a fatal blind spot. They had not accounted for the eventuality of a slave rebellion. Luria's directives regarding the enslaved populations were designed to transfer labor sectors occupied by slaves back to the Drea populace, thereby reinforcing her broader economic reforms. Furthermore, a select quota of highly skilled slaves was to be reallocated from the grueling labor of mines and construction into administrative and auxiliary military roles. The overwhelming majority, however, were slated for mass expulsion, funneled toward the borders of the Seram Empire and the perimeters of the Rawaka Hive, serving explicitly as demographic weapons. In essence, the Drea state had engineered a distinct operational protocol for every enslaved demographic. Gaij, a member of the Tessar race and a bound servant of Drea, found dangerous inspiration in the human exodus. Although the naturally potent psychic capabilities of the Tessar were brutally suppressed by Drea-forged arcane collars, Gaij had intercepted critical intelligence regarding his own fate. He was to be reassigned to the bureaucratic wing, tasked with the auditing and accounting of supposedly insignificant state archives. This single operational shift catalyzed his hatred-fueled grievances, refining them into a calculated strategy, the formation of a clandestine independence syndicate. His primary directive was twofold: to neutralize the suppressing effects of the arcane collars and to forge a verbal data network among the other skilled slaves, as their natural telepathy remained completely severed. By executing every assigned bureaucratic task with flawless precision, Gaij successfully infiltrated the blind spot of his overseers. For the first time in his existence, he was permitted beyond the dungeon walls, authorized to coordinate other Tessar subjects under Drea's supervision. Rather than arrogantly assuming Matriarch Luria had overlooked such a colossal vulnerability in the system, Gaij opted for absolute caution. He engineered a cryptographic language barrier within the internal flow of his network by exclusively utilizing the ancient Tessar tongue. This archaic dialect became their unbreakable cipher. Yet, despite this tactical triumph in communication, Gaij and his clandestine syndicate were, at this stage, still unable to decipher a method to defeat the arcane collars. Initial detection and the Ilizar anomaly, DC 343. Drea overseers rapidly detected the archaic dialect circulating among Gaij and his Tessar network. This critical intelligence, along with its potential ramifications, was escalated to Ilizar, Matriarch Luria's chief advisor. Although bound by a blood oath and absolute allegiance to his sovereign, Ilizar executed a highly irregular and calculated omission when drafting his report. The dossier Ilizar presented to Luria confirmed that the slaves were communicating in an undeciphered tongue. However, as chief advisor, he appended his own strategic recommendation: the immediate segregation of all Tessar subjects speaking this language. Crucially, he deliberately omitted the root node of this syndicate, Gaij. Ilizar's manipulative maneuver, however, was violently overruled by Luria's uncompromising doctrine. For the matriarch, the solution was brutal and absolute. She decreed the summary execution of any slave caught speaking the archaic tongue and mandated the exclusive use of the Drea language by law. To hammer this legislation into the minds of the subjugated, Luria ordered the public execution of several suspected Tessar individuals as a gruesome deterrent. Forced into a corner, Gaij evolved his methodology. The syndicate abandoned the ancient language and shifted to a far more insidious encryption model: linguistic steganography. Moving forward, the slaves would compress critical data and transmit it entirely within the Drea language, disguising the encoded intel as minor stutters, grammatical flaws, or calculated slips of the tongue. The warning of the Siram envoy. DC 344. The seasoned envoys of the Siram Empire maintained an unrelenting transmission of Shah Ravan's missives to Drea. However, as the calendar turned to DC 344, Ravan abruptly forced a distinct paradigm onto Matriarch Luria's agenda, a subject intimately recognized by every faction across Earthrealm. Ravan's focal point transcended the immediate border hostilities between Drea and Siram. The envoy directed the attention of Matriarch Luria, sovereign of Drea and master of the Lurnazan citadel, toward a much older, more profound presence. He spoke of the angelic individuals and their massive celestial army, a force long entrenched within Earthrealm, yet universally classified as alien entities to this realm. In the assessment of the Siram, the undisputed masters of the desert wastes, the entity commanding the celestial army, Archangel Kras, was a figure deemed too flawless and excessively revered. Furthermore, Earthrealm's collective perception of the angels had devolved into outright worship. Addressing the Silver Throne, the very core of the Lurnazan citadel, the Siram envoy delivered a chilling declaration: Kras's absolute power is an absolute threat. According to Shah Ravan, neither the true origins nor the ultimate objectives of the celestial army were discernible. The envoy emphasized that while the angels operated within Earthrealm as a neutral faction, employing optimistic rhetoric and blessing various races in alignment with their own divine doctrines, they remained a critical hazard that demanded rigorous scrutiny. Matriarch Luria's counter-strategy to this assessment had long been formulated, yet she deliberately veiled her true intentions from the Seram diplomat. Feigning an acquiescent stance toward the angelic presence, Luria successfully baited the envoy. Driven to break Drea's apparent passivity, the emissary pushed a dossier of highly classified Seram findings directly in front of the matriarch. The envoy first presented the findings of Sarek, Shah Ravan's trusted sorcerer and a master of the dark arts, who existed in perilous proximity to shadow entities. In Sarek's assessment, a palpable dark rot and underlying malice could be sensed in every inch of soil graced by Kras's footprint. Matriarch Luria immediately and coldly dismissed this intuition-based intel. Pivoting his strategy, the envoy submitted the tactical reports authored by the Shah's right hand, Sarkam. According to Field Agent Sarkam's analysis, the angels had not descended upon this realm as a blessing of the heavens and hope, but rather to execute a massive reconnaissance operation. Backed by concrete operational data, Sarkam asserted that the angels' initial point of incursion was the savage territories known as Peridia, located in the deep southwest of Earthrealm. Keeping her true stratagem entirely concealed, Luria delivered a chillingly brief verdict to the emissary. Drea shall remain allied with Kras. Denied the opportunity to present his remaining dossiers, the envoy was summarily expelled from the dismal chamber of the Silver Throne, and subsequently banished from Drea territory altogether. This anomalous diplomatic friction regarding the celestial presence was unilaterally terminated by Luria's directive. Consequently, by the absolute decree of Shah Ravan, the era of diplomacy with Drea was definitively severed. The covert stratagem Luria concealed from the Seram emissary was dangerously unilateral, a flawed calculus that entirely disregarded the Kras variable. The matriarch intended to weaponize the fanatical doctrine Archangel Kras was propagating across Earthrealm, co-opting this divine dogma as a mere instrument to accelerate her ongoing state reforms. The Amaru Coalition Initiative, DC 344. The Amaru, a populous, tribal, shamanistic, and rigidly conservative race of bipedal reptilians native to Earthrealm, resolved to initiate a secondary phase of coalition building with the Drea state. This strategic maneuver was executed at the direct behest of the colossal green dragon Rak-Kanix, a sovereign apex entity venerated by the Amaru populace as their father. Resurrecting a historical diplomatic protocol, the dragon Rak-Kanix intended to present Matriarch Luria, the new absolute master of Drea, with the very same pact of alliance he had once offered to her predecessor, the late King Nirzal. The parameters of Rak-Kanix's pacifist proposition were designed to synthesize the disparate Amaru and Drea cultures, foster amicable diplomatic channels, and establish secure interspecies commerce. The paramount article of the Dragon's Treaty, however, was a defensive and cohesive mandate, a strict mutual defense pact guaranteeing unconditional military intervention during times of war. Yet the Drea bureaucracy, spearheaded by Chief Advisor Ilazar, remained paralyzed by institutional reflex. Bound to the historical precedent established during the reign of the late King Nirzal, Ilazar formally advised Matriarch Luria to reject the prospect of this summit altogether, urging her to maintain the state's traditional isolationist stance toward the reptilian populace. Matriarch Luria decisively overruled her advisory board, formally accepting the Dragon's Summit. Within her strategic calculus, securing the unconditional mobilization of the Amaru military was a monumental advantage, particularly when factoring in the imminent threat of warfare bred by the volatile geopolitical climate. Furthermore, she accurately identified this prospective coalition as a vital catalyst, one that would forcefully legitimize and fortify her ongoing systemic reforms in both foreign policy and state commerce. Escorted by a phalanx of elite Praetorians meticulously handpicked by Drea General Manza, Luria embarked toward the Sat Valley. Situated at the perilous threshold where the Askadal mainland bleeds into the savage, untamed geography known as Al-Salit, this valley was designated as the neutral nexus where the matriarch would sit at the negotiating table with the Amaru. The diplomatic engagement between matriarch Luria and the dragon Rakkanix commenced within the neutral confines of the Sat Valley. The dragon's terms were unambiguous and ostensibly benevolent: cultural integration, secure trade corridors, and a definitive pact of mutual military reinforcement. However, the parameters of the summit were abruptly altered by the unsolicited arrival of the Angels, who were already operating within the region. At their vanguard was Archangel Kras, who seamlessly integrated himself into the diplomatic proceedings. Kras explicitly endorsed the pact between Rakkanix and Luria, actively motivating the matriarch by outlining the profound strategic advantages of accepting the dragon's terms. This unprecedented tripartite dynamic triggered immediate internal friction. Chief Advisor Ilazar and the accompanying Drea diplomats vehemently objected, invoking the doctrine of the late King Nirzal, who had categorically rejected both the Amaru and Archangel Kras in the past. Holding the isolationist traditions and diplomatic myopia of the former regime in absolute contempt, Matriarch Luria decisively ratified the treaty with the Amaru. By finalizing this pact under the direct observation and encouragement of Kras, Luria executed a calculated secondary maneuver. She officially conferred formal geopolitical recognition upon Archangel Kras and the Angel race. The Divine Domination Protocol, DC 344, the domain of theology and faith, was conspicuously absent from Luria's ongoing reform manifesto. However, the matriarch calculated that the fanatical divine system brought to Earthrealm and actively propagated by Archangel Kras could exponentially multiply both the momentum of her reforms and the absolute authority of the Silver Throne. Consequently, she summoned Kras, the leader of the Angels, directly to the Lernazan citadel. Accepting the invitation, Kras was ostensibly honored upon hearing Luria's reformist vision and her intended theological restructuring. He courteously assured the matriarch that she was walking a righteous path. Yet, while this cordial exchange transpired upon the Silver Throne, Chief Advisor Ilazar and the Drea bureaucracy had already begun to whisper a grim consensus in the shadows. Drea was playing with celestial fire. Luria's overarching objective was twofold: to forge an unbreakable domestic authority and to project a severe, paralyzing deterrent against her adversaries. To this end, she forcefully imposed Kras's self-made religion upon Drea, systematically codifying every facet of this divine system into state law. For the first time, Ilazar committed a slight breach of protocol, daring to question the ultimate purpose of this dangerous initiative. With absolute chilling composure, Luria articulated a singular maxim: those who control religions can also be controlled. The presence of Archangel Kras and his doctrine was a universally recognized reality across Earthrealm. Indeed, numerous minor factions had already devolved into worshipping this faith. Therefore, enforcing Kras's dogma as a state initiative did not appear as an anomalous tyranny. By weaponizing this pre-existing positive perception, Luria's true intent was to bend a supposedly divine power to her secular will, cementing her absolute rule. Every divine suggestion uttered by Kras was instantly transmuted into immutable Drea legislation. Non-compliance was met with summary execution. By executing this sharp pivot toward a theocratic model and explicitly aligning with the angels, Drea terrified its geopolitical rivals. To Shah Ravan, Emperor of Saram, an absolute non-believer, and Drea's ultimate adversary, this maneuver was not mere diplomacy, it was a blaring alarm of war. Recognizing the impending storm, Ravan immediately initiated full-scale military preparations. Saram's Golden Cordon, DC 344. To neutralize the demographic weapon unleashed by Drea, Shah Ravan issued an absolute directive to his trusted operative, Field Agent Sarkam, mandating a severe escalation of military protocol within the pre-existing Narvan buffer zone. Shifting Saram's operational stance from passive containment to a ruthless offensive, Ravan's orders were mercilessly explicit. Repel the refugee masses accumulating at Narvan. Execute any who breach the border. This decisive countermeasure served as a blunt geopolitical transmission, clearly demonstrating the emperor's military and political compass to Matriarch Luria. Executing the sovereign's will, Sarkam and his elite Saram vanguard systematically repelled the displaced populations clustering within the buffer zone, summarily executing any who resisted. To solidify this perimeter, heavy reinforcements were deployed from the imperial capital, Muhajarad, directly to the northern bulwarks of Narvan. Simultaneously, Saram Commander Keb mobilized the entirety of the military garrison stationed in the city of Sayin, anchoring massive fortification zones across the northeastern expanse of Narvan and the punishing Azaf Desert. Concurrently, Commander Ruzal transformed the coastal stretches of the Pendual region, situated north of the capital, into a living cordon of death. Every viable artery leading to Muhajarad was effectively severed. The geopolitical message was dispatched and unequivocally received by the Silver Throne. Drea's countermeasure to this militarized blockade was elegantly sadistic in its simplicity. Without drawing a single blade, the Drea vanguard systematically funneled the repelled refugee masses back toward the Narvan perimeter. Trapped within a fatal geopolitical crossfire between two absolute superpowers, the displaced populations were decimated against Saram's Golden Cordon. However, this ceaseless cycle of slaughter and repulsion fulfilled Matriarch Luria's precise strategic calculus. The continuous management of the border crisis acted as a parasitic drain on Saram's military and logistical reserves, effectively bleeding Shah Ravan's empire long before the anticipated Great War could even materialize. The Amaru-Drea Schism and Cultural Incompatibility, DC 345. The ratified treaty between Matriarch Luria and the Dragon Rak Khaniks remained in active effect. In accordance with the pact, numerous bureaucratic initiatives were launched to bridge the two factions, manifesting in newly established interspecies trade corridors. However, the Amaru and Drea populaces were fundamentally too diametric to sustain any genuine cultural synthesis. The two races' perspectives on commerce, morality, ethical consciousness, and, most critically, their religious dogmas were inherently incompatible, perpetually clashing rather than converging. While the Dragon Rak Khaniks optimistically perceived this profound socio-political friction as a mere matter of time, Matriarch Luria harbored no such illusions. To the Silver Throne, the sole intrinsic value of the Amaru populace was their utility as a lucrative revenue stream, and a surplus vanguard to be integrated into the Drea military apparatus. Luria was acutely aware that cultural integration was by no means a matter of time. It was a fundamental impossibility. These inherent frictions presented a strategic window of opportunity for Shah Ravan. Although no active hostility existed between Seram and the Amaru, Ravan convened his war council to neutralize the Drea threat embedded within the current geopolitical climate. The Seram Council, characterized by its plurality of strategic voices, debated several high-risk propositions. The first proposition advocated for escalating the localized tensions between the Amaru and Drea populaces through false flag assassinations executed by Seram operatives, deliberately framing the opposing side. While theoretically viable for fracturing the alliance, Ravan vetoed the maneuver. Should Seram's involvement be exposed, the empire would face the catastrophic reality of engaging both colossal forces simultaneously at full capacity. The second proposition leaned toward facilitated assimilation, operating on the premise that the ubiquitous Amaru population was double that of Drea. The projection theorized that the reptilian masses could organically assimilate the Drea state. However, this demographic shift would require an impractically long time frame to materialize. The final and most unprecedented proposition was delivered by Field Agent Sarkum. According to Sarkum's intelligence network, Chief Advisor Ilazar, the ultimate cog in the Drea bureaucratic machine, was actively seeking a clandestine parley with Shah Ravan. According to Ilazar's transmission, since his absence from the capital of Lurnazan for even a single day would be deemed unacceptable, and acknowledging the impossibility of luring the Shah to the enemy capital, the chief advisor requested that a highly trusted, stealth-capable proxy be dispatched directly to the dungeons of the Lurnazan citadel. Rather than personally infiltrating the heart of enemy territory to meet an allegedly treacherous Ilazar, Sarkum proposed deploying his most reliable operative, Agent Esul. With the Shah's explicit authorization, Agent Esul was dispatched into the subterranean depths of the Lurnazan citadel to rendezvous with the chief advisor. The Cartography of Philosopher Rahal, DC 345. In the epoch preceding her ascension to the Silver Throne, Luria had actively cultivated a council of philosophers, an exclusive assembly of intellectuals and ideologues capable of forging radical philosophies and engaging in ruthless dialectical warfare across virtually every discipline. Operating under the absolute aegis of the Silver Throne, the inductees of this consortium were strictly scions of the elite aristocratic bloodlines that had been closely aligned with the late King Nirzal. Dedicated to the surgical dissection of statecraft, sociology, morality, theology, and the mechanics of magic, the council now issued a formal petition to their former patron. However, they were no longer inviting a mere ambitious heir. They were requesting an audience with the absolute matriarch of the Drea kingdom. Shouldering the unrelenting geopolitical pressure of her reign, Matriarch Luria formally accepted the petition of the intellectuals she had previously assembled. Within her calculating mind, she deduced that a momentary psychological reprieve from the suffocating burden of the Silver Throne would yield no strategic detriment. However, the underlying premise of this specific summons was of unprecedented gravity. A prominent philosopher named Rahal asserted a monumental intellectual breakthrough. He claimed to have successfully rendered a functional cartography for a fundamentally alien dimension, a realm the Council had discovered long ago, yet whose purpose, logic, and physical laws had completely eluded their comprehension. Stripping the anomaly of its mystery, Rahal declared that he had finally mapped the bizarre, amorphous topography of the domain known only as the Arcane World. Positioned upon an elevated vantage point within the council chambers, Matriarch Luria coldly observed Philosopher Rahal's anxious yet feverish presentation. Rahal desperately sought to prove to the skeptical assembly that every intricate detail etched across 7 distinct parchments belonged to the arcane world. He was attempting to articulate the precise mechanism driving this seemingly nonsensical dimension. To Rahal, the scrawled cartography was absolute reality. The council and the matriarch, however, remained vehemently unconvinced. The exposition was so esoteric and bizarre that the purported mechanism eluded all comprehension. The collective assembly harshly declared that his illustrations only deepened the anomaly's obfuscation. Driven to desperate persuasion, Rahal attempted to decode the esoteric symbology anchoring his maps. Dot symbols represented immobile, static zones, while cross symbols denoted dynamic, luminescent objects in motion. At the epicenter of this matrix, he had inscribed a halo-like cipher, designating it simply as the light. He argued that the utilization of 7 sequential parchments was an absolute necessity to visually render the erratic kinetic progression occurring within that world. Just as Rahal attempted to fortify his thesis by citing crucial observations scribbled in his personal journal, Matriarch Luria rendered her final verdict. The summit was a severe, unjustifiable expenditure of the Crown's time. With absolute dismissal, she abruptly evacuated the chamber. Despite Rahal's frantic insistence, the discourse regarding the cartographic resolution and the true mechanics of the arcane world was definitively terminated, sealed away as the ramblings of a fractured mind. The Rendezvous in the Dungeons, DC 345. Seram Agent Esul had infiltrated the Drea Kingdom in total silence, utilizing the geographic obscurity of the Caden Islands to reach the peripheral city of Grazal. From Grazal, he navigated the tightly controlled heartland until he arrived at the capital, Lernizan. When he reached the imposing shadows of the Lernizan citadel, Chief Advisor Ilazar was already waiting for him in secret along the outer battlements. Ilazar, the very architect of Drea's bureaucracy, quietly unlocked a few critical heavy iron gates to let the enemy agent slip inside the fortress. Unseen by the royal guards, the two of them descended deep into the damp, echoing subterranean dungeons beneath the citadel. Chief Advisor Ilazar had brought a third figure into the claustrophobic depths of the dungeons, the slave Gaij. Thus the three of them, the bureaucrat, the enemy spy, and the subjugated, began their dark communion. Ilazar's proposition to Agent Esul was chillingly direct. If you wish to stop Drea, use Drea's own slaves. They are already organizing in the shadows. Invest in them. The initial shock on Gaij's face swiftly hardened into cold suspicion. The reality that the highest-ranking advisor of the Crown knew of this clandestine slave network and actively wished to fan its flames was highly alarming. Yet the bureaucrat's treasonous words represented an unprecedented opportunity for all the enslaved to finally break their chains. However, Gaij voiced a critical, insurmountable obstacle: the arcane collars Drea fastened around the slaves' necks to keep them bound. To think the slaves could mount a rebellion without first shattering these magical restraints was pure delusion. Seram Agent Esul calculated the odds and offered an immediate solution from his homeland. The Seram mage, Sarek, will nullify the effects of these collars. Gaij immediately pointed out the logistical nightmare of this proposal. If that is the case, then you must physically bring a collared slave to Sarek. It was then that Ilazar revealed the dark genius of his plan. offering the full weight of his position. A selected slave would be sent to the Narvan cordon under the guise of a strictly controlled, official deportation. The Seram soldiers guarding the region would then intercept this vital cargo and deliver them directly to the mage Sarek. Ilazar sealed the pact with a terrifying promise of institutional betrayal. "I will provide the bureaucratic groundwork required for this slave's deportation." Despite the menial nature of his bureaucratic tasks, Gai's flawless and meticulous execution of his duties had inadvertently transformed him into a recognized entity among the Drea bureaucrats. In a machine that operates on absolute conformity, a perfectly functioning cog is noticed. To suddenly orchestrate his deportation for this covert operation would inevitably draw the paranoid scrutiny of the kingdom's record keepers. His absence would leave a noticeable gap in the daily administrative flow. Therefore, it was decided in the dark of the dungeons. The collared pawn chosen for this clandestine exile had to be someone completely invisible to the eyes of the crown. The exiled slave had to be someone else. The light emerging in Lernizan's citadel, DC 346. The relentless density of Drea's bureaucracy, the suffocating workload it generated, the friction with rival factions, the sheer scale of military mobilizations, and the grueling process of assimilating Archangel Kras's dogma into the kingdom's machinery left no soul with a single moment of respite. As the calendar turned to 346, something profoundly anomalous, fundamentally wrong, and entirely illogical materialized in the vast courtyard leading to the silver throne within the Lernizan citadel. At the exact moment of the incident, Matriarch Luria and General Manza were together in the courtyard, dissecting the routine logistical nightmares manifesting along the Narvan and Drevazan borders. Directly before them, in the dead center of the courtyard, the very fabric of the air violently tore open. From within this impossible rift, the sound of a voice speaking echoed outward, as blinding, unnatural lights spilled from the tier, illuminating the cold, disciplined stone of the courtyard. Luria and Manza stood in absolute readiness, their steel already drawn from their scabbards to face the impossible. Contrary to every tactical expectation, the voice resonating from the rift carried an eerie, almost protective tone. It spoke of an impending cataclysm destined for Drea, urgently instructing them on the exact measures they must take at the absolute end of all things. The doom the light foretold was the surfacing of a colossal subterranean army known as the Nargal, a force that would completely erase the Drea kingdom from the map. The entity within the light stated with chilling certainty that this invasion could not be defeated in battle. However, by executing specific, forbidden rituals, they might secure a second chance at existence. General Manza, operating purely on the instincts of a Drea commander, immediately attempted to interrogate the phenomenon. He aggressively pressed for actionable military intelligence, the physical anatomy of the Nargal race, the numerical capacity of their forces, the exact metrics of their destructive capabilities, and the precise timeline of this promised invasion. The light's answer was absolute, shattering the general's tactical worldview. You cannot prevent the Nargal invasion, but for a chance at a second life, perform the rituals you have forbidden. There was a profoundly unsettling pattern to the anomaly's broadcast. At the absolute conclusion of every single sentence it uttered, the entity within the light rigidly and mechanically repeated the exact same absolute directive. It echoed with an unnatural authority, demanding the one concept most foreign to the kingdom's doctrine: cooperate. The light speaking from within the rift vanished as abruptly as it had appeared. The entire occurrence felt as though it did not belong to history itself. It was an absolute contradiction to the ordinary flow of time and the rigid logic upon which the kingdom was built. For the first time in her reign, Matriarch Luria was visibly unnerved. General Manza, conversely, reacted with the only doctrine he understood, immediately requesting authorization to mobilize and ready the kingdom's armies for war. This unprecedented anomaly was immediately suppressed. It was transcribed and sealed as a top-secret, highly classified document within the darkest vaults of the Drea State Archives. Wasting no time, Matriarch Luria issued an absolute emergency directive, summoning every high-ranking bureaucrat, strategist, and military commander back to the halls of the Lernazan Citadel. In truth, the entire bureaucratic machinery of the Drea state began to mirror Matriarch Luria's underlying trepidation. According to the kingdom's foremost strategists, the entire incident and the apocalyptic intelligence received were categorically baseless. There was no empirical record of a race known as the Nargal. Earthrealm had never recognized, witnessed, or even heard whispers of such an entity in recorded history. The strategists adamantly dismissed the warning as an absolute fabrication. A prominent faction within the council argued that this was a psychological operation orchestrated by their sworn enemy, the Seram Empire, designed solely to shatter Drea's structural equilibrium. The prowess of Seram mages and their mastery of the dark arts were well-documented threats. However, whether Seram possessed the sheer, apocalyptic power to tear a luminous rift directly into the impenetrable heart of Drea, inside the Lernazan citadel itself, was fiercely debated. The theory remained a complete enigma, devoid of any tangible evidence. Succumbing to an unprecedented paranoia, Matriarch Luria's immediate authoritarian directive was the absolute closure of all mining operations. These vast subterranean descents and deep excavation sites across the kingdom were suddenly perceived as fatal vulnerabilities, potential breach points for an unseen enemy. Acting upon Luria's command, General Manza initiated the massive, grueling logistical operation of withdrawing Drea's heavy military presence from the border cities, pulling the kingdom's absolute might inward to heavily fortify Lernazan. Sarek's Arcane Solution, DC 346. True to his treasonous pact, Chief Advisor Ilazar selected an utterly insignificant nameless slave from the masses and dispatched them to the Manazan region along the Narvan border. This was not flagged within the kingdom's records as a classified bureaucratic maneuver. Rather, it was perfectly camouflaged as an entirely mundane, routine deportation operation. Demonstrating absolute operational security, Ilazar refrained from transmitting any specific, suspicious directives to the Drea border guards stationed in Manazan. Instead, he had already entrusted the critical operational cipher to Seram Agent Ezul, a message intended solely for the eyes of the commander overseeing the Narvan buffer zone. The strategy executed flawlessly. The collared pawn crossed the threshold of the borderlands and was immediately intercepted by waiting Narvan forces. The slave was heavily secured and swiftly transitioned from a Drea exile into a high-value Seram asset. Under the impenetrable escort of Senior Field Agent Sarkam's elite vanguard, the slave was transferred directly to the heart of the enemy empire, the Seram capital of Muhajirad. Master Mage Sarek commenced an exhaustive methodical analysis to decipher the arcane matrix serving as the power source for the iron collar locked around the slave's neck. For 3 full days, Sarek subjected the artifact to a battery of tests, meticulously documenting the enchantment's volatile reactions to various magical and physical stimuli. His relentless efforts ultimately exposed the fundamental structural weakness within the Drea magic: extreme, paralyzing cold. By subjecting the arcane circuit to an absolute freezing state, the enchantment fractured. With the collar finally rendered inert, the Tessar slave experienced the unprecedented, staggering sensation of an unchained existence for the first time in his life. However, shattered iron does not immediately heal shattered flesh or spirit. The subject required a multi-week period of physical and arcane adaptation, harboring the desperate hope that his long-suppressed natural abilities would eventually reawaken. Consequently, to ensure the safety of this monumental asset, the Tessar slave was sequestered within a heavily garrisoned safehouse deep within the Seram capital of Muhajirad, placed under continuous armed guard. Master Mage Sarek quickly recognized the logistical impossibility of manually emancipating every collared slave across the vast expanse of Drea territory. Consequently, he engineered a highly potent alchemical solution, a specialized elixir designed to perfectly replicate his arcane freezing decryption. The mechanism of this countermeasure was devastatingly simple. A mere few drops of the liquid applied directly to the surface of the iron collar were sufficient to shatter the subjugating enchantment. Synthesizing approximately 30 vials of this volatile, paradigm-shifting mixture, Sarek officially transferred the payload to Agent Esul for immediate infiltration into enemy territory. Operating under the absolute sovereign directive of Shah Ravan, Esul embarked on the treacherous path once more. However, infiltration protocols were strategically altered. Esul would not risk a second direct breach of the capital. Instead, a trusted operative, a shadow fiercely loyal to Chief Advisor Ilazar, was dispatched to rendezvous with the Seram agent in the peripheral city of Grazal. It would fall upon this Drea insider to bear the immense risk of smuggling the classified cargo past the impregnable, highly paranoid security checkpoints of Lurnazan. The Sigil of Retribution Incident, DC 346. For the people of Drea, absolute faith began with the state and ended with the sovereign. Although no ruler of Drea had ever commanded the populace to worship them as a deity, the kingdom's burdens had always been profoundly mortal, grounded in survival, war, and logistics rather than the divine. For this precise reason, assimilating the self-proclaimed religion, forged and championed by Archangel Kras, into the Drea society proved disturbingly effortless. Matriarch Luria, having ruthlessly codified Kras's dogma into absolute law, had achieved total structural compliance. However, deeply unnerved by the relentless succession of anomalies and unseen blows striking her kingdom from multiple angles, the matriarch was beginning to pivot. She was turning inward, fixating on a vastly different, darker spectrum of emotions stirring within her own mind. The Drea populace was successfully embracing Kras's doctrine, standing as undeniable proof of the legislation's efficacy. Both the masses and the Archangel were deeply satisfied with this sociological panorama. Yet, when Archangel Kras ascended the steps to the Silver Throne for a royal audience, he found himself standing before a fundamentally altered leader of Drea. Archangel Kras, having arrived to dissect the divine trajectory and dictate future strategic opportunities, was deeply unsettled by Luria's erratic demeanor. The matriarch was entirely unresponsive to his expectations. She withheld the anticipated words, and most crucially, she refused to submit. The diplomatic discourse rapidly devolved into a volatile confrontation. Kras anchored his wrath upon an exceedingly dangerous truth. Your people worship me, yet you do not obey me. It was an undeniable reality. Luria was completely unyielding. Consumed by divine fury, Cras lashed out. Then what is the purpose of this alliance? Have you no regard for your enemies? They lie in wait for the slightest fracture to drown you in your own ruin. How dare you reject the very pillar of power you lean upon me? It was at that absolute apex of tension that Matriarch Luria made the sovereign decision to officially sever the alliance. In response, the Archangel's fury materialized into something catastrophic. With raw arcane force, he scorched a massive, luminous sigil directly into the unyielding stone floor of the throne room. "This sigil is my retribution upon you," Cras roared. "You will pay the price of your defiance with the blood of your people. When the absolute fall of Drea comes to pass, you will raise your hands to the heavens and beg for salvation. But I will leave your pleas entirely unanswered. While you pray in absolute despair, I will grant you nothing but silence." The sheer magnitude of the sigil was devastating. Its arcane shockwave bypassed every physical absolute of the Drea kingdom. It pierced directly through the immensely thick fortifications, the endless corridors, and the very structural reinforcements that held the Lernizan citadel together, radiating its destructive resonance down through the earth, echoing violently into the deepest subterranean layers of the capital. This very sigil acted as a cataclysmic beacon. Its arcane resonance violently penetrated the abyssal strata of the earth, reaching a realm entirely unseen by mortal eyes and utterly absent from all recorded history. The shockwave struck the domain of the Nagal, a colossal subterranean empire inhabited by a merciless army forged of pure, primordial fire. Though the covens of the Nagal witches could not comprehend the precise nature or the author of the arcane signal, they swiftly delivered the revelation to the absolute sovereign of the deep dark, the ruthless emperor Saeros. The barbaric Nagal horde, a chaotic force constantly thirsting for absolute war, had just caught the scent of foreign life dwelling directly above them for the first time in their existence. Driven by an insatiable, violent hunger for destruction, they immediately commenced their relentless mobilization. The subterranean empire began clawing its way upward, executing the preliminary logistical and physical excavations required to initiate a merciless invasion of the surface world. It was at this exact devastating juncture, standing before the smoldering ruins of the Alliance etched into her throne room floor, that Matriarch Luria's ironclad mind violently recalled the impossible anomaly of the recent past. The cryptic prophecy delivered by the luminous rift in the citadel courtyard echoed back to her with terrifying, crystal-clear precision. "You cannot prevent the Nagal invasion, but for a chance at a second life, perform the rituals you have forbidden. Cooperate." Driven by the cold, logistical survival instincts that defined her reign, Luria recognized the ultimate necessity of the moment. The Drea kingdom had to commence its most desperate preparations without a single second of delay. The Protocol of the Iron Silence, DC 346. The catastrophic retribution enacted upon the Silver Throne was swiftly compounded by an even more monumental decree. Archangel Cras declared the absolute immediate withdrawal of all his angelic legions from Earthrealm. The celestial host broadcasted the commencement of a phase they designated as the Iron Silence, a vow of absolute, unyielding muteness as they systematically abandoned the plane. Inevitably, the intelligence of this divine exodus permeated the espionage networks of the rival Seram Empire. Senior Field Agent Sarkum recognized this unprecedented withdrawal not as a divine mystery, but as a critical, time-sensitive tactical opportunity. Based on his meticulous historical analysis, the initial incursion of the angelic forces into Earthrealm had occurred within the geographical confines of a region designated as Peridia. Operating on the tactical deduction that these entities would utilize the exact same uncharted trajectory for their extraction, Sarkum refused to let the moment slip. Mobilizing his elite vanguard, the Seram agent immediately initiated a covert deployment. They infiltrated the specific sector of Peridia known as Randell, successfully establishing a heavily concealed forward operating base directly along the anticipated route of the divine departure. Several days following the commencement of the Iron Silence, the angelic host materialized within the fog-drenched marshlands of Peridia. Seram field scouts immediately secured visual confirmation, relaying the intelligence back to Senior Agent Sarkum and officially initiating the shadow pursuit. Maintaining strict operational distance, Sarkum's elite vanguard tracked the celestial procession as they traversed the massive eastern peak of the Randell sector. Upon cresting the summit, the Angelic Legion began a deliberate descent into a deep, concealed canyon lying beyond the mountain. Situated at the absolute epicenter of this canyon was a derelict Drea military installation. The strategic records of this structure date back to the distant annals of antiquity, predating even the reign of King Nirzal. During that forgotten epoch, the fortress had ultimately buckled under the ceaseless, relentless incursions of the Amaru race. Consequently, the kingdom had executed a total evacuation and abandoned the outpost. Yet, despite centuries of absolute neglect, the imposing, fortified structural skeleton of the base remained entirely intact, standing as a silent monument to Drea's ancient wars. Upon observing the celestial host breaching the perimeter of the ancient Drea installation, Senior Agent Sarkum and his elite operatives immediately halted their pursuit. Engaging or attempting to infiltrate a localized concentration of hundreds of thousands of angelic entities was an absolute tactical impossibility. It would have resulted in an instantaneous, unsalvageable annihilation of the Seram vanguard. The primary operational objective, however, had been flawlessly achieved. Harboring the grim, calculated satisfaction of having definitively validated his own geographical and strategic hypothesis, Sarkum made the command decision to stand down. His immediate directive was to comprehensively update his preliminary intelligence dossier and present the finalized, indisputable evidence of the angelic withdrawal directly to the sovereign authority of Shah Ravan. Maintaining strict operational discipline, the Seram reconnaissance team held their concealed perimeter for a standard rotational cycle. Extracting from the canyon the following day, the operatives successfully exfiltrated the Peridia region, initiating their long, undetected march back to sovereign Seram territory. Operating on the highest echelons of Seram intelligence protocol, it was a calculated certainty that Senior Field Agent Sarkum and his vanguard would return. The directive was unambiguous. Once the celestial host had entirely evaporated from the realm, concluding their absolute withdrawal under the guise of the Iron Silence, the Seram operatives would execute a secondary infiltration of the Peridia region. Their tactical objective was absolute. They were to descend back into the concealed canyon and subject the derelict Drea installation to an exhaustive, microscopic, forensic sweep. Every archaic stone, every collapsed corridor, and the very soil of the abandoned outpost would be scrutinized inch by inch. Sarkum's elite unit was tasked with hunting for any residual arcane signatures, celestial anomalies, or hidden physical evidence left in the wake of the Angel's monumental departure. The absolute focus of the Drea Kingdom pivoted abruptly to martial readiness, saturated with the frantic desire to establish a supreme defensive perimeter and an underlying, pervasive trepidation. Matriarch Luria's convened strategy council relentlessly debated the sigil of retribution scorched into the throne room floor by Archangel Kras, analyzing its potential catastrophic ramifications. Yet, despite the apocalyptic context, a prominent faction of experts maintained an entrenched, bureaucratic skepticism. Could the entity's action within the throne room not be entirely symbolic? This event might possess zero correlation with the anomaly's prophecy. Let us not act in haste, nor deviate from our established geopolitical realities. Chief Advisor Ilazar attended every assembly, absorbing every spoken word. However, the singular vision materializing in his calculating mind was nothing less than a colossal operational opportunity. Exploiting Drea's paralyzing preoccupation, Ilazar initiated the construction of a clandestine, hyper-secure intelligence corridor, bridging his loyalist faction directly to the Siram Empire. The foundation of this data trafficking system necessitated the aggressive fortification of Ilazar's shadow network within the peripheral city of Grazal, heavily greased by massive, untraceable deployments of bribery. The counternode of this traffic, the Siram Empire, would utilize the geographic obscurity of the Khaden Islands, ensuring all intelligence oscillated exclusively between Grazal and Khaden. Shah Ravan issued an absolute directive. A specialized Siram espionage cadre was to establish a permanent forward operating base upon the Khaden Islands. Through this nexus, Ravan would intercept every whisper echoing from the heart of Drea. This shadow corridor was critical not only for intelligence flow, but as the primary artery for executing the slave mobilization initiative. Now fully briefed on the cataclysm warning delivered to Luria and the retaliatory sigil struck by Kras, Shah Ravan refused to gamble on an immediate slave uprising. If the intercepted intelligence proved accurate, an unfathomable invasion awaited Drea. Absolute annihilation was a high probability. Therefore, once unshackled from their arcane collars, these slaves represented a highly potent military asset. To waste this demographic in a doomed rebellion against a mythical subterranean force was tactically unsound. The clandestine directive was fundamentally altered. The collared populace must be systematically extracted and relocated to the Khaden Islands. The strategic viability of this exfiltration was fiercely debated within the Siram capital of Muhajirat. A militant faction within the council argued for the immediate ignition of the uprising to fracture Drea's infrastructure, entirely neutralizing their defensive capabilities before the prophesied invasion could even materialize. However, as Shah Ravan held the absolute authority to dictate the fate of the entire Siram race, his solitary verdict superseded all debate. Ravan calculated the apocalyptic rumor to be factual. His master mage, Sarek, was incessantly sensing a violent, unending unrest, vibrating deep within the terrestrial strata. If the colossal Nagal invasion erupted, the slaves would perish alongside Drea. A collared slave is merely defenseless prey. Yet, if they were successfully funneled to the Khaden Islands and emancipated from their iron restraints, they could be seamlessly integrated into the Siram military apparatus as vital auxiliary infantry, defending against an invasion highly likely to spill across imperial borders. Consequently, Ravan maintained continuous, unbroken contact with Sarek. By pinpointing the exact temporal eruption of the subterranean threat, the Shah intended to execute the mass slave transfer to Khaden at the absolute optimal moment. Factoring the psychological endurance and motivation of the enslaved masses into his strategic calculus, Shah Ravan explicitly sought to secure their absolute loyalty. To forge this trust and weaponize their desperation, the emperor transmitted a definitive, calculated declaration to the Shadow Syndicate. In the event of an absolute cataclysm, the gates of the Seram Empire stand open to you. The Death Warrant of Elazar, DC 346. As the clandestine operation to forge an intelligence corridor and funnel the enslaved populace toward the Khaden Islands progressed with relentless momentum, a fatal breach occurred within the kingdom's internal security. One of the Shadow Clerks, covert operatives answering exclusively to Matriarch Luria, delivered a comprehensive dossier detailing Elazar's protracted treasonous activities straight to the Silver Throne. These Shadow Clerks were a direct manifestation of the Matriarch's sweeping reforms in domestic administration. They functioned as autonomous auditors, deliberately severed from Elazar's established bureaucratic chain of command. Naturally, the chief advisor had anticipated these newly implemented oversight mechanics. He had successfully compromised a fraction of them through untraceable bribes and neutralized others via blackmail, effectively setting his own spies to watch the Matriarch's inspectors. Yet one particular clerk maintained an unyielding loyalty to the crown, distilling a grueling, long-term investigation into a devastatingly precise indictment. The contents of this final dossier extended far beyond the chief advisor's own espionage. The loyalist had systematically documented the widespread corruption and illicit actions of their own compromised peers, the very inspectors Elazar firmly believed he had securely silenced. The chief advisor had long anticipated this exact vulnerability, mapping out a contingency for his eventual extraction. Historically, Matriarch Luria's private summits with her clerks were exceedingly brief, and Elazar was strictly barred from attending them. However, this particular loyalist had preemptively requested an extended audience, explicitly stating that the upcoming dossier contained severe evidence of high treason, and audaciously suggesting that the chief advisor be summoned to face the accusations. Recognizing this immediate glaring disruption of standard protocol, Elazar ignored the summons of the Silver Throne and initiated his flight. Leveraging the vast resources of the Shadow Syndicate he had cultivated in Grazal, he began frantic preparations to secure a maritime passage to the Khaden Islands. Elazar's absence from the royal court had already ignited Luria's fury. Scrutinizing the Shadow Clerk's extensive dossier, page by page of concrete, undeniable proof, and finding the serpent of her state missing from the chamber was the only confirmation she required. The document reflected undeniable truth. Without a fraction of hesitation, the matriarch issued an immediate decree of execution. Drawing upon the geographic intelligence within the report, she accurately deduced that her former advisor would attempt to surface in the peripheral city of Grazal. Yet, dispatching riders from the capital to the distant borders would cost precious time. Before Luria could formulate a logistical countermeasure, the Shadow Clerk revealed a brilliant, preemptive initiative entirely omitted from his written text. Anticipating the sovereign's lethal verdict, the operative had already orchestrated a silent alliance with General Manza a full week prior. Together, they had mobilized trusted military contingents across Grazal, locking down every operational port with unflinching, loyalist steel. Their standing orders were merciless. The traitor was to be executed on sight, the very second he materialized. Perfectly aligned with the anticipated timeline, the port of Grazal was completely saturated with Manza's vanguard. Upon realizing the trap, Elazar's loyalist escort prepared to draw steel and engage the garrison. However, the chief advisor firmly rejected this bloodshed, declaring that he would walk to his demise alone. He reasoned that exposing his remaining operatives to immediate slaughter was tactically unsound, and that raising swords against the kingdom's own military was a hollow, meaningless endeavor. Before the arresting vanguard, he delivered his final testament. "My war is with the volatile, perilous reforms dictated by matriarch Luria, mandates that violently contradict the foundational traditions of the Drea state. The kingdom's military does not belong to her. It belongs to her late father, King Nirzal. I will gladly pay the toll for walking Nirzal's path alone." Offering not a single breath of resistance, Ilazar surrendered himself to the kingdom's soldiers. The architect of Drea's bureaucracy was summarily executed by the sword in the central square of Grazal. Upon receiving the intelligence of the Grazal execution, the Saram espionage network stationed on the Caden Islands transmitted a final, concise dispatch to the capital of Muhajirat. "The enemy collaborator has fallen. We await your command to withdraw to the center." Issuing the order to exfiltrate, Shah Ravan harbored a grim, partial satisfaction. The clandestine operation had successfully extracted a vast demographic of the enslaved populace from Drea territory before the corridor collapsed. However, Gaij, the primary architect of the Tessar Syndicate, remained trapped within the impregnable walls of Lurnazan, still wearing his arcane collar to avoid drawing lethal suspicion. Heavily implicated throughout the Shadow Clerk's dossier, Gaij was sentenced to serve as a gruesome, unforgettable deterrent to the remaining slave populace. His fate was sealed. He would endure severe, prolonged torture upon the towering battlements of the Lurnazan citadel, overlooking the entire capital before facing a public execution. With merely 24 hours remaining until his agonizing demise, the Tessar leader sat in the suffocating dark of the subterranean dungeons, orchestrating a desperate salvation. He had already concealed a few precious drops of Master Mage Sarek's freezing elixir inside the hollow chamber of a signet ring. It was a staggering irony. The ring was a minor token previously granted to him by the very Drea bureaucracy he now sought to dismantle. His strategy was razor-thin and relied on sheer, devastating timing. He would unleash the alchemical payload to shatter the arcane collar under the cover of dead night. If his long-suppressed psychic abilities surged back with enough volatile force to tear the stone walls of his cell apart, Gaij intended to carve his own bloody path out of the capital. The Psychic's Awakening, DC 346. Applying the stolen alchemical frost to his arcane collar, Gaij finally shattered the iron that had bound his mind for a lifetime. With his suppressed psychic faculties violently surging back to life, he unleashed a devastating wave of kinetic fury, completely obliterating the iron bars and dense stone walls of his subterranean cell. Moving with lethal precision, the Tessar leader swiftly recovered the remaining cache of Sarek's elixir from its concealed location within the dungeons. Rather than hoarding the countermeasure, he distributed the volatile liquid among the captive golem subjects, massive, subjugated entities forged entirely of living rock. Once unchained, the golems transformed into an unstoppable force of vengeance. They initiated a brutal, systematic dismantling of the Citadel's subterranean infrastructure, mercilessly hunting down the Drea guards one by one. Simultaneously, Gaij emancipated a small cluster of his fellow Tessar. Because their physical and mental faculties were severely atrophied from years of magical suppression, these individuals were utterly defenseless. Stepping into the void, Gaij assumed the mantle of their sole protector, while the towering golem vanguard effectively engaged and occupied the citadel's elite Praetorian guards in a localized, chaotic bloodbath, Gaige and his vulnerable convoy successfully breached the fortress perimeter unseen. Forced to chart an evasive trajectory to avoid immediate pursuit, they fled northward from the capital into the punishing, snow-buried expanse known as Sire. To survive the lethal, freezing gales of this unforgiving terrain, the fugitives sought immediate refuge deep within a desolate mountain cave, bracing themselves against the brutal elements of their newfound freedom. The Nagal Invasion, DC 347. They arrived on the very first day of the year, 347. Erupting from the exact center of the Askadal mainland, just slightly south of the capital Lernizan, the subterranean empire violently clawed its way to the surface. Emperor Seiros materialized amidst the devastation, a towering, terrifying sovereign forged entirely of living fire. Only a single, devastating command echoed from his blazing form: burn. Beyond that, the horde offered only silence. The Nagal forces exhibited a horrifying, almost jubilant savagery. Their invasion was not a calculated military campaign. It was a rabid celebration of slaughter. From the rearguard, the covens of Nagal witches systematically hunted down Drea soldiers from afar with lethal precision. Their infantry poured forth like a ceaseless, unyielding storm of fire. Detonating upward from the subterranean depths across numerous regions of Askadal, they mindlessly attacked the very first targets they perceived, the sprawling infrastructure of the Drea kingdom. Within the first 7 days of the invasion, every single Drea border city had already been reduced to smoldering ash. Lernizan, the impenetrable heart of the kingdom, desperately held the line. By the 13th day of the invasion, the entirety of the Drea kingdom's cities lay in ruins. General Manza, fiercely protecting Matriarch Luria, was systematically pushed backward, their forces steadily losing ground and being driven toward the savage territory of Al-Salit. The Nagal pressure was overwhelming and relentless. Executing a desperate final tactical retreat, General Manza gathered Luria and the surviving remnant of approximately 3,000 Drea soldiers, dragging them into Peridia, the most miserable and treacherous sector of Al-Salit. He was forced to march them over the eastern peaks of Randel, descending into the hidden canyon that harbored the derelict Drea military installation. This ancient abandoned outpost now stood as the singular, final stage where their ultimate destiny would be decided. The sweeping state reforms Matriarch Luria initiated in the year DC 342, a grand, meticulous design slated for definitive completion in DC 347, were entirely eclipsed by the apocalyptic shadow of the Nagal incursion. In a cruel, devastating twist of historical irony, her 5-year manifesto did not culminate in the kingdom's supreme ascension. Instead, her legacy was abruptly transmuted into a grim, unforgettable dark symbol, standing perpetually synonymous with the complete and terrifying erasure of Drea from the maps of Earthrealm. The total numerical capacity of the Nagal forces deployed in this catastrophic invasion was an unfathomable 14 million entities. The Cooperation, DC 347. Plagued by a torrent of unanswered questions, profound regret, and heavy sorrow, Matriarch Luria stood within the ancient outpost in Peridia, having entirely forsaken the shattered majesty of the Lernizan citadel. The culmination of these catastrophic events violently forced her to recall a singular, haunting detail: the prophecy of the luminous anomaly. You cannot prevent the Nagal invasion, but for a chance at a second life, perform the rituals you have forbidden. Cooperate. Standing before the final remnant of her military, approximately 3,000 Drea soldiers, Luria delivered her ultimate decree. They would execute the forbidden ritual. This arcane working was nothing short of a colossal, desperate gamble. They would permanently discard their physical vessels, embracing death to tether their naked souls into mundane, inanimate objects. Once imprisoned, escaping the artifact through their own volition was entirely impossible. To be reformed from this stasis required a highly specialized savior, a practitioner possessing profound mastery over both Drea arcane arts and the esoteric soul magic. Tragically, no such mage existed anywhere within the borders of Earthrealm. Yet, they committed to the gamble. They enacted the very ritual their ancestors had fiercely outlawed. 3,000 valiant soldiers, alongside matriarch Luria herself, were transmuted into helpless, dormant entities trapped within simple relics, silently waiting to be unearthed. Choosing deliberate death to evade slaughter was a bitter paradox. However, they heeded the ominous warning of the light. They finally learned to cooperate. Within the imposing stone walls of the military base in Peridia, not a single living Drea remained to draw breath. It is a profound tragedy that the very concept of the Drea was instantly reduced to a mere memory across Earthrealm. The Drea race was systematically subjected to total genocide in the year 347, consumed entirely by the Nagal invasion. The Archangel's answer, DC 347. Acting upon the strict warnings of the Dragon Rakkanix, the Amaru race retreated into hiding. Their isolation was driven by two stark realities. Engaging the Nagal horde was a suicidal endeavor, and their prior coalition with Drea had yielded nothing but bitter friction. Seeking refuge deep within their subterranean labyrinths, the reptilian populace chose a path of calculated indifference, passively observing the total erasure of the Drea kingdom to avoid catastrophic risk. In the northwestern Askadal territory of Dwol, the Rawaka hive mobilized their insectoid legions, keeping their forces on high alert against the subterranean threat. Yet, even the disciplined hive mind recognized they possessed no genuine defense against an ocean of living flame. The Seram Empire stood braced to endure the crushing momentum of the Nagal vanguard. However, the primordial fire had incinerated a superpower like Drea with such terrifying velocity that the opportunity to render military aid or even establish a unified front never materialized. Not a single faction across the realm harbored the delusion that the Nagal could be halted through conventional warfare. In this paralyzing despair, a singular, desperate hope echoed across the collective consciousness. If only the angelic host had never abandoned Earthrealm. It was the exact same prayer Drea had screamed into the void, only to be met with deafening silence. Suddenly, Archangel Kras and his celestial legion materialized once more within the fog-drenched, forsaken lands of Peridia. They returned vastly more numerous and profoundly more terrifying than before. Wasting not a single second, millions of battle-ready angels plunged violently into the heart of the Nagal army. Kras orchestrated a ruthless strategy to confine the cataclysm strictly to the Askadal mainland. The celestial host encircled the subterranean invaders from all flanks, compressing the horde into a suffocating, restricted kill zone. What followed was a grueling, month-long slaughter, a relentless clash that afforded neither sleep nor the luxury of tactical hesitation. The Nagal armies suffered a catastrophic routing. While the invaders were not entirely eradicated, they were violently forced to retreat into the abyssal depths from whence they came. The chaotic fire entities buckled under the overwhelming might of an angelic host that seemingly mocked their primordial flames. Having tasted the surface world, Emperor Saeros officially declared the Celestial Army as his supreme nemesis before withdrawing back into his infernal domain. Upon securing a definitive victory, Archangel Kras relentlessly pursued the fractured Nargal forces deep into the subterranean crust for several days. Reaching a critical depth, the Archangel enacted a second, monumental working of arcane power, the Sigil of Banishment. From that moment onward, no force in existence, save for Kras himself, possessed the capability to summon the Army of Fire back to the surface. The culmination of these events guaranteed that Kras's supreme authority was recognized without a shred of dispute, cementing his legacy as the ultimate hero of Earthrealm. However, Shah Ravan, the Emperor of Siram, who had meticulously analyzed the underlying mechanics of this entire crisis step by step, adamantly rejected this global consensus. To the Shah, this entire salvation was nothing but a meticulously orchestrated theater, a grand deception. Though Ravan pragmatically bent the knee before Kras, alongside the other sovereign races out of sheer diplomatic formality, he was far too shrewd a statesman to be blinded by the performance. The paramount authority governing Earthrealm now solely belonged to Archangel Kras and his celestial legions. Whatever fate awaited the realm next would be dictated entirely by the Archangel's conscience and his unyielding initiatives.